The following lesson is linked to Learning Outcome 2, Reading and Viewing. It addresses the assessment standard that requires learners to explore and explain key features of texts and how they contribute to meaning in visual, audio, and multimedia texts. Learners should be able to recognize the use of visual, audio, and audiovisual techniques, such as the use of color, dialogue, music, sound, lighting, editing, framing, styles of shot, camera techniques, foregrounding, and backgrounding.
Hi, I'm Megan. You may have seen our previous series of lessons on film. In this series of lessons, we are going to be revising the film study techniques and the effects that these have that we learnt about in the previous series, but this time we're going to be looking at some examples of short films. You watch television shows and films all the time, but perhaps you have never thought of them as texts. In the same way as novels and poems are texts which can be studied, you can also study films as texts. Just like studying novels or poetry in detail enhances our enjoyment because we're able to understand the themes and messages, studying films in detail can also help to enhance our enjoyment. Also, if we understand the techniques that have been used to make a film, we have a greater appreciation for it, and also are less likely to be wrongly influenced by film. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to comment on the genre of some films and understand some of the reasons why films are made. We have said that films can be studied in the same way as novels. Just like novels are divided into different genres, so are films. Do you remember what a genre is? A genre is a type of literature. So some examples of film genres are horror films, musicals, and westerns. Determining the genre of the film that you're studying is an important step. This is because different genres often follow set formulas and use stereotypical characters. Have a look at these typical characters that we're all familiar with in the next example. A Hollywood film that is part of the teen romance genre may include a love triangle between a gorgeous cheerleader, the football captain, and a nerdy new girl who is really a beautiful person on the inside. All three of these characters are stereotypes. They represent types of people that we are familiar with. Knowing the genre of the film is important because it will help you to work out the types of characters and plots that you can expect and how to respond to them. Knowing the genre of a film will also help you to determine whether the events being depicted on screen are fictional or factual. In other words, are they real or have they been made up? Some genres of film are made simply to entertain audiences. This is the main aim of far-fetched science fiction films. You know that the characters in them are fictional. They're not real, but come from the author's imagination instead. You also expect the plot to be far-fetched and unbelievable. Other film genres are romances or comedies. The characters and settings that are shown are a lot closer to real life than in science fiction films, but as the audience, we still know that the events being shown are fictional or made up, and that the situations might be exaggerated. In some dramas, filmmakers may take an event that really occurred and use this as the basis of their story. You may have seen or heard of the film Titanic. There really was a ship called the Titanic that hit an iceberg and sank on its first voyage. So that part of the story is true. So films like Titanic combine some fact with some fiction. Films like these are known as historical dramas. This is because the historical part of the film is true, although the filmmaker may bend the truth a little to make the film more exciting. In this series of lessons, the clips come from a film called Come See the Bioscope. This is an example of an historical drama. Before we find out more about this film, let's think for a minute why filmmakers make films. Filmmakers may make films to tell a story, share a message, or make an artistic statement. By making an artistic statement, filmmakers use film as an art form that has the power to communicate ideas in the same way as other forms of art like painting or sculpture. Because a filmmaker would want to achieve at least some of these aims, he or she has to choose the subject matter very carefully. Come See the Bioscope was written as part of the New Directions series. This project is sponsored by Mnet, and in it, young scriptwriters send their scripts to Mnet, who then select the best ones to be turned into short half-hour films. In the case of the film Come See the Bioscope, the filmmaker has chosen to tell part of the life story of Solomon Plaatje. Now, of all the possible topics that the filmmaker could have chosen, you may be wondering why the story of Sol Plaatje was chosen. You may even be wondering who Sol Plaatje was. Well, if you carry on watching this series of lessons, you will see that this film manages to achieve the aims we referred to earlier. The film Come See the Bioscope tells a story, shares a message, and makes an artistic statement. The film definitely tells you more about Sol Plaatje, who he was and what he did for South Africa. So this filmmaker achieves the aim of telling a story that is historically accurate. The film also shares a message. The main themes are perseverance, patriotism, and fighting injustice. But the film is not just a history lesson. It is also shot in an artistic way, so that it is not only visually pleasing to look at, but the way that the images have been filmed and chosen helps to tell the story. In the next few lessons, we are going to be looking at clips from this film so that you're able to see how the filmmaker achieves the aims of filming. But in order to set the scene, let's find out a bit more about Sol Plaatje. We are going to be looking at who he was, what he did, and why the film Come See the Bioscope centers on this man as the main character. Now, unlike most characters in films, Sol or Solomon Plaatje is a real character. He's not fictional or made up. It's quite possible to watch this film and understand it without knowing anything about the real character, but our understanding of the plot and the messages of this film will be enhanced if we understand who the real character was. So before we look at the film, here's a brief history lesson. Sol Plaatje was an author and intellectual who fought for better conditions for black people. Even although his own education didn't go beyond primary school, he learned to speak 8 languages, including Dutch, English, and German, as well as several African languages. He edited 3 newspapers, wrote several books, and translated 2 of Shakespeare's plays into Tswana. After attending a mission school in the Northern Cape, he became a letter carrier for the post office and later an interpreter and clerk in the magistrate's court in Mafeking. During the siege of Mafeking, he worked as a war correspondent and later became editor of an English Tswana newspaper. His work with the newspaper enabled him to meet many influential people and politicians, but for Plaatje, his most important meeting was an interview with David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister of the time. This came about as a result of his involvement with the South African Native National Congress, the modern-day ANC, of which he was the first Secretary General. His access to leaders in government, his concern for the rights of black people, his fluency in languages, as well as his determination to work hard, had made him an obvious choice for this position. Plaatje's passion was appealing against the Land Act of 1913. This act meant that black South Africans did not have the right to buy or lease land in their own country. He travelled the country on a bicycle to research the effects of the act on African people and was part of a group that travelled to England to appeal against the act. After he met with Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, Lloyd George wrote to General Jan Smuts, appealing to him to hear the grievances of Sol Plaatje's group. But as South Africa no longer fell under British rule, there was not much more that he could do. Well, now that you're familiar with the basic outline of the story of Sol Plaatje, we're ready to see how the filmmaker has interpreted this. We've just outlined broadly his main achievements, but we haven't gone into much detail. Think back to our quick outline of the things that he achieved. It would be very difficult for a filmmaker to be able to tell his whole story thoroughly and well in a half-hour film. Instead of trying to tell the whole story of Sol Plaatje in a half-hour film, it would be much better for the filmmaker to highlight a few key events and to perhaps mention other achievements as part of the background to the film. From what you now know about Sol Plaatje, what do you think the filmmaker may have chosen to focus on and why? As we continue with this series of lessons, see if your predictions are correct. It's also important to see some of the filmmaking techniques that have been included to enhance the way the story is told. Now that you know a bit more about the genres of films and some of the reasons for films being made, it's time for today's task. Different filmmakers will interpret different historical events in different ways. Your task is to imagine how you might have condensed a lot of information into a short space of time if you were the filmmaker of Come See the Bioscope. Also think about how you would have shown that the action took place a long time ago. Here are some questions to think about. How could you convey a lot of information about a character in a short space of time? And how could you show that the action was set a long time ago? Exchange your ideas with other people in your class. There are no right or wrong answers for this task because there's not just one way of doing these things. But it will be interesting to see how the suggestions you and your classmates come up with compare to how the filmmaker did it. You'll be able to compare your answers to the real film as we continue with these lessons, so be sure to join me then. Goodbye.